Cassandra Thornfield stared at the financial report in her hands, her blood turning to ice. The numbers were wrong. Not just slightly off, deliberately, catastrophically manipulated. Before she could process what this meant, her phone buzzed with a message from HR, immediate meeting in the main conference room. The Monarch Capital headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming Chicago skyscraper, but as Cassie walked down the corridor, the panoramic views of Lake Michigan did nothing to calm her racing heart. Something was very wrong. She pushed open the heavy glass door to find a tribunal waiting for her. Elliot Blackwood at the head of the table, flanked by the head of HR and Vance Holloway, her mentor and the company's chief investment officer. The room fell silent as she entered. "Take a seat, Miss Thornfield," Elliot said, his voice as cold as his steel-gray eyes. The next 20 minutes destroyed 3 years of impeccable work. Spreadsheets, timestamps, access logs, all presented as evidence that she had manipulated data on the Artemis Fund, costing clients millions. Evidence that pointed unequivocally to her. "This is impossible," Cassie said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I didn't do any of this." "Your credentials were used," Elliot replied flatly. "The timestamps match your building access. The changes came from your terminal." "Someone framed me," she insisted, looking to Vance for support. Her mentor avoided her gaze. "That's a serious accusation," Elliot said. "Do you have evidence?" She didn't. "Not yet. Monarch Capital has a zero-tolerance policy for financial misconduct," Elliot continued. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to clear your desk." "You can't do this," Cassie said, rising to her feet. "I've given everything to this company. And now you've taken even more," Elliot replied. "Consider yourself lucky we're not pressing charges yet." The humiliation of being escorted out by security, carrying her personal items in a cardboard box while colleagues watched, burned into her memory. By evening, her company email was disabled, her access revoked, and her reputation in financial circles destroyed. 3 months later, Cassie sat in her small apartment, surrounded by rejection emails. No financial firm in Chicago would touch her. Her savings were dwindling, and her student loans loomed. She'd tried everything to clear her name, but without access to Monarch systems, she had no way to prove her innocence. The knock on her door was unexpected. The elegantly dressed courier even more so. "Miss Thornfield, this is for you." He handed her a cream-colored envelope bearing the Blackwood family crest. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Miss Thornfield, your presence is requested at Blackwood Manor tomorrow at 2 p.m. sharp for a matter of mutual benefit. A car will collect you at 1 p.m. Vivian Blackwood." Cassie almost threw it away. Vivian Blackwood was Elliot's eccentric aunt and the founder of Monarch Capital. What could she possibly want? But curiosity and desperation won out. The following day, a sleek black car delivered her to an imposing limestone mansion on Lake Michigan's North Shore. The housekeeper led her through rooms filled with priceless art to a sunroom where an elegant woman in her 70s sat beside a table set for tea. "Miss Thornfield, finally we meet," Vivian said, studying her with piercing blue eyes, the same shade as her nephew's. "I've heard a great deal about you. All terrible things, I'm sure," Cassie replied coolly. "Actually, quite the opposite before your unfortunate situation." Vivian gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Cassie remained standing. "I don't see what we could possibly have to talk about. How about your career? Your reputation? Your future?" Vivian poured tea into a delicate cup. "Or perhaps how you might return to Monarch Capital." That caught Cassie's attention. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I never joke about business," Vivian replied. "Tell me, what would you do to clear your name?" "Anything legal," Cassie said without hesitation. "I didn't commit fraud." A small smile played at Vivian's lips. "I believe you, which is why I have a proposition for you." The double doors to the sunroom burst open before she could continue. Elliot Blackwood stormed in, fury evident in every line of his body. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, glaring at Cassie before turning to his aunt. "Joining us for tea," Vivian replied calmly. "Perfect timing, Elliot. I was just about to explain how Miss Thornfield will be saving Monarch Capital and your career by becoming your wife." The teacup in Cassie's hand crashed to the floor, spilling across imported marble as her world tilted for the second time in 3 months. "This is absurd," Elliot said, his voice dangerously quiet. Have you lost your mind? On the contrary, Vivian replied, signaling the housekeeper to clean up the broken teacup. I'm offering a solution to both your problems. Cassie found her voice. I'd rather work at a fast food drive-thru than marry him. And I'd rather liquidate the company, Elliot added. Vivian remained unfazed. You need this marriage, Elliot. The Al Nasser Group won't finalize our deal unless they believe you're a stable family man. Their conservative values run deep, and they don't trust bachelors with billions. Then I'll find someone else, Elliot snapped. In 2 weeks. Vivian raised an eyebrow. Besides, we need someone who understands finance. Someone who can act the part at social functions. Someone with everything to gain by making this work. She turned to Cassie. And someone who desperately needs what only we can provide, redemption. Cassie crossed her arms. Why would anyone believe this sudden romance? The entire financial community knows he fired me in disgrace. Which makes our narrative even more compelling, Vivian said. The wrongfully accused analyst whose brilliance caught the CEO's attention. The behind-the-scenes investigation that cleared her name. The unexpected romance that bloomed during the process. She smiled. People love redemption stories, especially when they end in romance. This is insane, Cassie muttered, but her mind was racing. Could this be her way back in? Her chance to access the evidence she needed? The PR campaign has already begun, Vivian continued, sliding a tablet across the table. On the screen was a press release draft. Monarch Capital CEO announces internal investigation exonerates former analyst. Romance blooms from professional respect. You can't seriously expect me to marry her, Elliot said, but Cassie noticed something shift in his expression, calculation replacing outrage. 1 year, Vivian said firmly. You marry for 1 year, secure the Al Nasser deal, and then quietly divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Ms. Thornfield receives a generous settlement, a cleared record, and excellent references. And what do I get besides a temporary wife? Elliot demanded. The $30 billion deal that saves the company from the liquidity crisis you've been hiding, Vivian replied calmly. Elliot's face went pale. How did you? I founded this company, dear nephew. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the financial maneuvering? Cassie glanced between them. What liquidity crisis? The one your alleged fraud helped cover up, Vivian said. Monarch needs this deal or hundreds of jobs disappear, including yours, Elliot. A tense silence filled the room. Cassie's mind whirled with possibilities. This arrangement could give her everything she needed, access to the company records, proximity to potential suspects, and financial stability while she cleared her name. I want full reinstatement, Cassie said suddenly. Same position, same salary, plus compensation for lost wages. Absolutely not, Elliot objected. Full reinstatement, Vivian agreed, ignoring him. But in our compliance department, not analytics. That position has been filled. With whoever they're using to continue the fraud, Cassie thought. I want unrestricted system access, she pushed. Standard compliance access, Vivian countered. Anything more would raise suspicions. And a formal, public apology from him, Cassie added, pointing at Elliot. Out of the question, he growled. A public statement acknowledging an internal investigation revealed inconsistencies in the evidence against you, Vivian offered. The details remain confidential due to ongoing security concerns. Cassie considered this. And living arrangements? You'll move into Elliot's penthouse, of course. Separate bedrooms, but you must present a united front in public. This is a business arrangement, Elliot interjected. Nothing more. Naturally, Cassie replied coldly. I wouldn't have it any other way. Then we're agreed? Vivian asked. Elliot paced the room, tension radiating from him. Finally, he turned to Cassie. If I find any evidence you actually committed that fraud, deal or no deal, I'll bury you. Likewise, if I discover you were behind framing me, she countered. They glared at each other until Vivian cleared her throat. I'll take that as a yes from both of you. The wedding will be in 2 weeks. Small ceremony, lavish reception for business contacts. 2 weeks, Cassie exclaimed. The Al Nasser representatives arrive in 3, Vivian explained. We need you established as a couple beforehand. On her way out, Cassie paused beside Elliot. For the record, I despise everything about this. The feeling is entirely mutual, he replied. The following days passed in a whirlwind. Vivian's PR team positioned their story as a corporate fairy tale. The CEO who discovered troubling inconsistencies in a terminated employee's case, personally investigated, fell in love during the process, and now sought to make amends professionally and personally. Financial blogs buzzed with the news. Former colleagues reached out, their previous coldness replaced with fawning congratulations. Through it all, Cassie smiled, played her part, and counted the days until she'd have access to Monarch systems again. The night before the wedding, Cassie sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by packed boxes. Tomorrow she'd say vows she didn't mean to a man she couldn't stand, all to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Parking garage. 10 minutes. Come alone. Against her better judgment, Cassie went. In the dimly lit garage, a figure emerged from between cars. Elliot. I needed to be clear about something before tomorrow, he said without preamble. This marriage is a business transaction. I don't trust you. You don't trust me. But we both need this to work. I'm aware of the terms, she replied stiffly. Not all of them. His voice dropped. There's more happening at Monarch than you know. The fraud you were accused of is just the surface. Be careful who you trust. Before she could question him, he turned to leave. 1 year, Cassandra. We just need to survive 1 year. As his footsteps echoed in the concrete structure, Cassie wondered what she was really walking into, and whether the price of clearing her name might be higher than she'd calculated. The wedding ceremony was mercifully brief, held in the glass-enclosed rooftop garden of the Blackwood family's downtown building. Only a handful of witnesses attended: Vivian, the company's legal counsel, and 2 senior board members. Cassie wore an elegant ivory sheath dress, while Elliot was in a tailored charcoal suit. They exchanged simple bands and clipped vows, neither meeting the other's eyes as they said, "I do." The reception that followed was an entirely different affair. Monarch Capital's grand ballroom had been transformed with white roses and crystalline decorations, creating an atmosphere of romantic opulence. Chicago's financial elite circulated, champagne flutes in hand, all eager to witness this unexpected union. "Smile," Elliot murmured, his hand firm at the small of Cassie's back as they greeted guests. "The Al Nasser representatives are watching." Cassie maintained her practiced smile. "Your concern is touching, husband. Just playing my part, wife." His voice was cool, but his public demeanor was that of a smitten groom. He kept her close, occasionally leaning in to whisper something that made her laugh on cue. As they made their rounds, Cassie noticed a lean man with sharp features watching them intently. When Elliot steered them in his direction, she felt him tense slightly. "Blake," Elliot said, "I don't believe you've formally met my wife." Blake Reynolds had a handshake like a vice and eyes that evaluated her with naked suspicion. "A pleasure, Mrs. Blackwood. Your rise from disgraced analyst to CEO's wife has been quite meteoric." "The truth has a way of emerging," Cassie replied smoothly. "Sometimes it just needs a champion." "Indeed." Blake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been Elliot's executive assistant for 6 years. We've weathered many storms together." The possessive way he emphasized "we" wasn't lost on Cassie. "Then I'm grateful he has such loyal support. Blake handles my schedule, communications, and most confidential matters," Elliot explained. "You'll be seeing a lot of him." "I look forward to it," Cassie said, not meaning a word. As they continued through the reception, Cassie was introduced to Vance Holloway, her former mentor who had remained conspicuously silent during her termination. He embraced her with practiced warmth. "Cassie, my dear, this is wonderful news. I always knew there was more to your story." "Did you?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "I don't recall you speaking up at the time." His smile faltered momentarily. "Corporate politics can be complex. But water under the bridge now, yes? Your family." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by a striking woman with copper hair and a calculating smile. "Elliot, darling, you've been keeping secrets," she said, air kissing his cheek before turning ice blue eyes on Cassie. "Meredith Sinclair, CFO. And you must be the rehabilitation project." Cassie matched her smile what for what. "Cassandra Blackwood, wrongfully accused analyst. But you'd know all about the financial discrepancies, wouldn't you, Meredith?" A flash of something, alarm, crossed the CFO's face before her social mask slipped back into place. "Elliot, your bride has claws." How refreshing. After the reception, the newlyweds were driven to Elliot's penthouse in the exclusive Gold Coast neighborhood. The sleek, modern apartment occupied the top 2 floors of a historic building, with panoramic views of the lake and city. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Elliot said, loosening his tie as they entered. "Mine is at the opposite end of the hall. The housekeeper comes Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I leave by 6:30 most mornings." "How romantic," Cassie muttered. "This isn't a romance, it's a business arrangement. I suggest we establish clear boundaries." "Fine," she agreed. "Rule 1. We maintain appearances in public, but in private, we stay out of each other's way. Rule 2. What happens at Monarch stays at Monarch. Business doesn't come home. Unless it pertains to clearing my name," Cassie countered. Elliot's jaw tightened. "You'll have compliance access. Use proper channels." "The proper channels failed me before." They stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Elliot sighed. "Rule 3. We communicate. No secrets, no surprises. If you find something, you come to me first, not HR, not legal, not Vivian." "Same goes for you," Cassie said. "Full transparency." "Agreed." He hesitated, then added, "One last thing. The Al Nassers are sending a representative to stay at their downtown property next week. They'll likely invite us to several social functions. Their culture values family above all else." Meaning we need to be convincing," he said. "They'll be looking for signs this is real." "I'm an excellent actress," Cassie assured him. "Good," Elliot replied, heading toward his bedroom. "Because $30 billion depends on your performance." Cassie's first day back at Monarch was surreal. Colleagues who had avoided eye contact in the hallways now greeted her warmly. Her new office in the compliance department was smaller than her old one, but positioned strategically near the executive suite. "Mrs. Blackwood," Blake appeared in her doorway, tablet in hand. "I've been asked to get you up to speed on company protocols. Many things have changed in your absence." The orientation was clearly designed to emphasize limitations rather than access. Blake highlighted multiple security measures, all while reminding her of the sensitive nature of her position as both an employee and the CEO's wife. "I understand my responsibilities," Cassie said when he finished. "Is there anything else?" "Just one thing," Blake replied, his voice dropping. "Elliot built this company into what it is today. He works harder than anyone, cares more than anyone, sacrifices more than anyone. Whatever game you're playing, whatever angle you're working, I will not let you hurt him or Monarch." Before Cassie could respond, her office phone rang. Blake turned to leave, pausing at the door. "That phone only rings when Elliot calls. I suggest you answer it." "Cassandra." Elliot's voice was brisk. "There's a situation at the youth center. I need you to accompany me this afternoon." "The youth center?" "The Lakeside Mentorship Center. It's in my calendar. Blake will drive us at 2. The Southside Youth Center was nothing like what Cassie expected. The renovated warehouse buzzed with activity. Teenagers working on computers, playing basketball, studying in small groups. Elliot, a heavy-set man with a booming voice, approached. "And this must be the new Mrs. Blackwood." "Marcus Davis, center director." "Cassie, please," she replied, shaking his hand. "Elliot's our biggest supporter," Marcus explained as they toured the facility. "Without him, we'd have closed years ago." Throughout the visit, Cassie watched as Elliot transformed from the cold executive she knew into someone else entirely, warm, engaged, remembering kids' names and their personal struggles. The teenagers clearly adored him. "Why this place?" she asked as they left. Elliot was quiet for a moment. "My parents died when I was 16. Financial scandal, similar to what you were accused of. They were innocent, but no one believed them. I had Vivian, but not everyone has someone to catch them when the system fails." It was the most personal thing he'd shared, offering a glimpse of the man behind the executive facade. For just a moment, Cassie felt something shift between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps a hint of understanding. The moment shattered when Blake pulled the car up. "Sir," Miss Sinclair called. "There's an issue with the quarterly projections." As they drove back to Monarch, Cassie stared out the window, mind racing. She'd seen another side of Elliot today, but more importantly, she'd gained her first real access to the company's systems. And buried in those compliance records, she'd spotted something odd. A series of transaction flags that had been systematically overridden just days before she was accused of fraud. The hunt for her vindication had officially begun. The compliance department gave Cassie access to transaction flags, regulatory filings, and audit logs that painted a disturbing picture. For 3 weeks, she methodically combed through records, identifying patterns that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. Multiple compliance alerts had been suppressed right before her termination, all concerning the Artemis Fund she'd been accused of manipulating. Every morning at precisely 8:15, Blake would appear at her office door with coffee, black, no sugar, and the same suspicious gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, placing the cup on her desk. "Elliot asked me to remind you about dinner with the Al Nassers tonight. He suggests the navy dress from Neiman's." "I'm capable of dressing myself," Cassie replied, not looking up from her screen. "Of course," Blake hovered. "May I ask what you're working on so intently? Perhaps I could assist." Cassie minimized her window. "Just familiarizing myself with the compliance protocols. Thank you for the coffee." Blake lingered, eyes drifting to her computer. "Elliot values transparency. It would be unfortunate if you were pursuing personal matters on company time. Is there something specific you want to know, Blake?" "Just looking out for Elliot's interests, which are now aligned with mine," she reminded him. "At least on paper." After he left, Cassie reopened her work. She discovered that someone had created an elaborate approval chain that effectively masked the source of certain investment decisions. The chain led through 3 departments before reaching the Artemis Fund, making it nearly impossible to trace accountability. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot. "Lunch. Rooftop. 10 minutes." The rooftop garden was empty except for Elliot, who stood by the railing overlooking the city. "Blake's watching me," Cassie said without preamble. "Blake watches everyone," Elliot replied. "It's his job. He's looking at my computer when I step away. Are you finding anything worth seeing?" Cassie studied him, weighing how much to reveal. "Maybe. There's an irregular approval chain on the Artemis Fund. It's sophisticated, designed to obscure who's making decisions." Elliot's expression remained neutral. "Could it be legitimate?" "Technically, yes. Practically, no. It's unnecessarily complex, which usually means someone's hiding something. Or someone's being cautious with a high-value fund." "Is that what you believe?" Elliot turned to face the skyline. "What I believe doesn't matter. What you can prove does." "Why did you really bring me up here?" Cassie asked. "The Al Nassers are sending their representative to dinner tonight. Khaled Al Nasser, the founder's son. He'll be evaluating us, both the company and our—" He hesitated. "Relationship." "I'll play my part," she assured him. "It's more than just an appearance," Elliot said. "In their culture, business and family are inseparable. They're entrusting their family wealth to us, so they need to believe in our family values. I'm aware of the stakes." "Are you?" His tone sharpened. "Because you've been investigating instead of preparing. Do you know their customs? Their expectations of a CEO's wife? The topics that would offend them?" The criticism stung more than it should have. "I can handle a business dinner. This isn't just any business dinner. It's the difference between saving Monarch and watching it collapse." For a moment, genuine worry flashed across his face. 342 employees depend on this company. On this deal, Cassie felt a flicker of understanding. Despite everything, Elliot cared about his people. "I'll study up this afternoon," she promised. "No one will question our relationship." That evening, Khaled Al Nasser joined them at Elliot's private dining room at Alinea. In his early 30s, Khaled was Western-educated but deeply traditional, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, taking Cassie's hand. "You are even more lovely than your photographs. I understand you and Elliot have quite the love story." Cassie smiled warmly, sliding naturally into the role they'd rehearsed. Sometimes life brings people together in unexpected ways. Throughout dinner, she and Elliot performed flawlessly, exchanging fond glances, finishing each other's sentences, touching casually but intimately. She spoke knowledgeably about the Al Nasser family holdings and Middle Eastern investment principles, having spent her afternoon researching rather than investigating. "You know," Khaled said over dessert, "when I heard Elliot Blackwood had suddenly married, I was skeptical. Chicago's most dedicated bachelor, falling in love so quickly? But seeing you together." He smiled appreciatively. Some connections cannot be explained by logic alone. As they returned to the penthouse, the tension that had built from their performance lingered. Acting like a couple in love required a physical and emotional proximity that left them both discomfited. "You did well," Elliot said as they entered the apartment. Khaled was impressed. "We both played our parts," Cassie replied, slipping off her heels. Yes, but your research was thorough. That comment about his grandfather's shipping business caught his attention. I'm good at my job, Elliot. All of my jobs. She paused, including finding out who framed me. His expression closed off. We agreed. Business stays at the office, I know. But I need to tell you something. She lowered her voice. Meredith has been meeting with Vance regularly. Off-site, not on their calendars. That's hardly suspicious. They work closely on investment strategy. At midnight, in a bar in Wicker Park, far from where either of them lives. Elliot frowned. How do you know this? I have my sources, Cassie replied. In truth, she bribed a junior analyst who owed Meredith for past mistreatment to track the CFO's movements. If you're implying something, be direct. I'm not implying, I'm investigating. And I'm finding connections between Meredith, Vance, and the irregularities in the Artemis Fund. Elliot's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Blake's on his way up with urgent documents for the Al Nasser deal. The next morning, Cassie arrived at the office to find Meredith waiting in her doorway. Enjoying playing house with Elliot? The CFO asked, examining her manicure. Did you need something, Meredith? Cassie kept her tone professional. Just a friendly warning. The compliance department isn't a playground for amateur sleuths. Meredith stepped closer, dropping her voice. Whatever you think you're finding, you're out of your depth. Some systems are designed to protect the company, not harm it. Is that what you were doing? Protecting the company? Meredith's smile was shark-like. I've always had Monarch's best interests at heart. And Elliot's. I'm sure that's why you meet Vance in obscure bars late at night. Company interests. A flash of alarm crossed Meredith's face before she recovered. Be careful, Cassie. Not everyone appreciates your return as much as Elliot seems to. That afternoon, Cassie was summoned to a quarterly review meeting, normally outside her department's purview. She entered the boardroom to find Elliot, Vance, Meredith, and several directors already seated. Cassandra, Vance greeted her with manufactured warmth. We were just discussing the Artemis Fund's performance. Since you've been reviewing its compliance history, we thought you might contribute. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. They'd lured her into a meeting to expose any unofficial investigation. I'm still getting up to speed on historical compliance, Cassie replied carefully. But I'd be happy to listen and learn. The presentation began, with Meredith highlighting the fund's remarkable recovery after unfortunate irregularities earlier in the year. The implication that Cassie had caused those irregularities hung unspoken in the air. As charts displayed on the screen, Cassie noticed something odd. The recovery pattern looked artificial, too perfect to be market-driven. Before she could examine it closer, the slide changed. Vance wrapped up with projections for the upcoming quarter, directing a pointed question at Cassie. Given your expertise with this fund, where do you see potential compliance concerns in our strategy? The room fell silent, all eyes on her. They were testing her, looking for evidence she was digging where she shouldn't. Elliot watched her intently, his expression unreadable. Would he back her up or let her walk into their trap? Actually, Cassie said, meeting Vance's gaze directly, I've been meaning to discuss revised documentation protocols with you. Some of the approval sequences seem unnecessarily complex from a compliance perspective. She felt Elliot shift beside her as she carefully navigated the question, acknowledging her findings without revealing their significance. Perhaps we should discuss that privately, Vance suggested smoothly. We wouldn't want to bore the board with technical details. As the meeting adjourned, Cassie felt the weight of what she'd just done. She'd publicly signaled to Vance that she was onto something, a dangerous move if he was indeed behind the fraud. Elliot caught up with her in the hallway, guiding her into an empty conference room. What was that about? He demanded. They were testing me, Cassie replied. I had to say something. You just put a target on your back. I already had one, she countered. At least now they know I'm not blind to what they're doing. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, genuinely agitated. Cassie, if they feel threatened, they might what? Frame me for fraud. She laughed bitterly. Been there, done that. For a moment, concern flashed across his face. Not for the deal or the company, but for her. It was gone so quickly Cassie thought she might have imagined it. Just be careful, he said finally. And next time, warn me before you poke the bear. Rain lashed against the windows of Elliot's Range Rover as they drove north along the lakefront. The weekend retreat to the Blackwood family estate in Lake Geneva had been scheduled months ago, an annual autumn tradition, according to Vivian. For Cassie, it represented 48 hours trapped with Elliot, his suspicious assistant, and potentially the very people who had orchestrated her downfall. "Blake sent your schedule to your phone," Elliot said, breaking the silence. "There's a dinner tonight with some board members, breakfast meetings tomorrow, and a small cocktail gathering tomorrow evening with local financial leaders. All work, no play," Cassie murmured, watching raindrops race down her window. Vivian said this was a retreat. For her, it is. For us, it's another performance. The windshield wipers slashed rhythmically as they turned onto a private road. Through the gray curtain of rain, Cassie caught glimpses of manicured grounds before the imposing stone mansion came into view, lights glowing warmly against the stormy backdrop. "Home sweet home," Elliot said, a trace of irony in his voice. Inside, the house hummed with quiet activity, staff preparing for the weekend, early arrivals settling in. Vivian greeted them in the grand foyer, elegant, as always, in a cashmere ensemble. "There's my favorite power couple," she said, air-kissing them both. "You're in the East Wing, Elliot's usual rooms. I've put Vance and Meredith in the West Wing. I know how you value your privacy." "Vance and Meredith are here?" Cassie asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Of course, dear. Key leadership always attends." Vivian's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Don't worry, the walls are quite thick." After settling in, Cassie examined their suite, a spacious sitting room separated two bedrooms, offering privacy while maintaining appearances. She unpacked quickly, then pulled out her laptop. Without the office network restrictions, she might make more progress on her investigation. A knock interrupted her concentration. "Mrs. Blackwood." Blake stood at the door, his expression as dour as the weather. "Mr. Blackwood requests you join him in the library. He's reviewing quarterly projections, but thought you might appreciate the view." The library occupied the mansion's southeast corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Despite the storm, it was an impressive sight. Angry waves crashing against the shoreline, distant lightning illuminating dark waters. Elliot sat at an antique desk, surrounded by papers and a laptop. He glanced up when she entered. "Blake find you." He did, still watching my every move. "He's protective," Elliot replied, returning to his work. Cassie wandered to the windows. "I thought we were supposed to maintain our loving couple facade. Hard to do when you're buried in work. That's for dinner. For now, everyone assumes we want privacy." "Privacy would be nice," she muttered, thinking of her interrupted investigation. Elliot's typing paused. "Something on your mind, Cassandra?" "Just wondering why Vivian invited Vance and Meredith when she knows I suspect them. Perhaps to see how you handle it," he suggested, closing his laptop. "Or how they respond to you. My aunt rarely does anything without multiple motives." Cassie turned from the window. "Like arranging our marriage?" "Exactly like that." She studied him, the controlled posture, the carefully neutral expression. Even after weeks of living together, Elliot remained a cipher. "Why did you really agree to this arrangement? The company's financial situation couldn't have been your only motivation." Elliot was quiet for a long moment. "Vivian has a controlling interest in Monarch. She may be semi-retired, but her word is still law." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting today." He stood, gathering his papers. "Dinner's at 7. We're something impressive." The storm intensified through the afternoon, with weather alerts warning of potential flooding and power outages. By dinner time, the wind howled around the mansion's stone corners, adding a dramatic backdrop to the evening's performance. Cassie wore a deep emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair, with the diamond earrings Elliot had given her as a wedding gift, delivered by his assistant with a typed note explaining they were family heirlooms that would make their marriage appear more legitimate. She descended the grand staircase to find Elliot waiting, impeccable in a charcoal suit. "You look lovely," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, offering his arm with practiced ease. Dinner was an elaborate affair in the mansion's formal dining room. Vivian presided at one end of the table, Elliot at the other, with Cassie to his right. Across from her sat Vance, with Meredith beside him. Board members and their spouses filled the remaining seats. Throughout the meal, Cassie maintained her role, the adoring, intelligent wife, offering insightful comments about finance while gazing at Elliot with manufactured admiration. He played his part equally well, touching her hand occasionally, sharing private smiles. I must say, Vance commented during dessert, marriage agrees with you, Elliot. I've never seen you so relaxed. The right partner changes everything. Elliot replied smoothly, his fingers brushing Cassie's wrist in a gesture that sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. And you, Cassie, Meredith said, her smile sharp as a blade. It must be quite the adjustment, from disgraced analyst to CEO's wife in just a few months. Some might call it a fairy tale, Cassie replied pleasantly. Others might call it justice. The conversation shifted to the Al Nasser deal, with Vance highlighting the projected returns and expansion opportunities. Cassie noticed how he deftly avoided specifics about risk assessment, the very area where she'd found irregularities. After dinner, the group moved to the drawing room for drinks. The storm outside had knocked out power to much of the area, but the mansion's generator kept essential systems running, creating an intimate atmosphere with reduced lighting. Cassie circulated, gathering snippets of conversation while keeping Vance and Meredith in her peripheral vision. They spoke briefly but intensely in a corner before separating, with Meredith approaching Elliot and Vance making his way to Cassie. Quite the comeback story, Vance said, sipping his bourbon. I always knew you were exceptional, though this isn't the path I would have predicted for you. Life takes unexpected turns, Cassie replied. Indeed. He studied her over his glass. I understand you've been reviewing some of my fund structures in your compliance role. Among others. It's part of my job. Of course. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I just wonder, given our history, if there might be a personal element to your scrutiny. Cassie matched his smile what for what. I approach all my work with the same thorough attention to detail, Vance. You taught me that. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a thunderous boom that rattled the windows. The remaining lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness before emergency lighting activated, casting everyone in a soft, golden glow. Looks like we're on essential power only, Vivian announced. Perhaps it's time to call it a night. We have flashlights for everyone to navigate to their rooms. As guests dispersed, Elliot materialized at Cassie's side, guiding her toward the staircase with a protective hand at her waist. The gesture might have been for show, but in the semi-darkness, it felt genuinely supportive. Back in their suite, Cassie kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. Well, that was intense. You handled Meredith and Vance well, Elliot said, loosening his tie. Though I think you've definitely confirmed their suspicions about your investigation. Good, Cassie replied. Let them worry. Elliot shook his head. You're playing a dangerous game. No more dangerous than the one you're playing, she countered. I saw your financial projections earlier. The company's in worse shape than you've admitted, isn't it? The question hung in the air between them. Finally, Elliot sighed. Yes. Without the Al Nasser deal, we'll have to start layoffs within 2 months. The admission surprised her, not the content, but his willingness to share it. Is that why you never challenged my firing? Because you needed a scapegoat for the financial manipulations? I didn't know, Elliot said quietly. Not at first. The evidence against you seemed conclusive. And later? When you did know? He didn't answer, moving instead to the sideboard where a bottle of scotch stood. Drink, if you're having one. He poured 2 glasses, handing one to Cassie. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a momentary contact that felt oddly charged in the dimly lit room. When did you start to suspect I was innocent? She pressed. Elliot took a long sip before answering. 3 weeks after you left. Some inconsistencies in the audit trail. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to make me question the narrative. But you didn't contact me. It was too late, he said. The story was out there. Your reputation was already damaged. And he hesitated. I'd already played my part in it. The admission hung between them. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest thing to regret she'd heard from him. A crash of thunder shook the house, and the remaining lights went out completely, leaving only the faint glow from the fireplace embers. I should check on the generator, Elliot said, moving toward the door. Wait. Cassie caught his arm, the darkness making her bolder. Why are you telling me this now? In the dim firelight, his expression was unreadable. Because you deserve to know. And because we're both in too deep to back out now. The moment stretched between them, tension building with each passing second. Another lightning flash illuminated his face, his guard down, something vulnerable in his eyes that she'd never seen before. The spell broke when Elliot's phone lit up with Blake's call. He stepped away to answer it, speaking in low tones. When he returned, his professional mask was firmly back in place. Generator issue. I need to go down and help. Blake is coming to escort you to the main hall where there are emergency lights and backup heating. After he left, Cassie sat in the near darkness, processing their conversation. Elliot had admitted doubting her guilt, but had done nothing. Why? What was he hiding? Unable to sleep and unwilling to wait for Blake, she used her phone's flashlight to navigate to Elliot's bedroom. Perhaps his private files might contain answers he wouldn't give her directly. His room was meticulously organized, with nothing out of place. She checked drawers and the closet, finding nothing incriminating. Just as she was about to leave, her flashlight caught a reflection from something under the bed, a laptop, different from the one he'd been using earlier. Pulling it out, she found it was password protected. She tried several combinations before entering the date of his parents' death, information she'd learned from a news article about the scandal that had ruined them. The screen unlocked. What she found shattered everything she thought she knew. Elliot had been conducting his own investigation into the Artemis Fund fraud, and he'd been doing it for months, even before her termination. Spreadsheets, screenshots, access logs. He'd been building a case against someone within the company. And based on the most recent files, that someone was Vance Holloway. Find what you're looking for. Cassie whirled around to find Elliot standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the laptop screen. You've been investigating Vance, she said, not bothering to deny her snooping. All this time? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Elliot stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Because I wasn't sure who I could trust, including you. You thought I might be working with Vance. Cassie's voice was incredulous. After what he did to me, I didn't know what he did to you, Elliot replied, moving closer. Not definitively. I had suspicions, theories, not proof. The laptop screen illuminated their faces in the darkness, casting sharp shadows. Outside, the storm continued to rage. How long have you been investigating? Cassie asked. Since before you were fired. I noticed irregularities in the Artemis Fund 6 months ago, small at first, then increasingly blatant. When you were implicated, the evidence seemed solid, but something felt wrong. So you fired me anyway. I had no choice. The board was breathing down my neck. Investors were panicking, and the evidence all pointed to you. Cassie gestured to the laptop. Not all of it. Not enough to clear you at the time. He ran a hand through his hair. After you left, I dug deeper. The more I found, the more I suspected Vance. But he's careful, connected, and has been with the company since my father's time. And where does our marriage fit into this investigation? It wasn't my idea, Elliot reminded her. But when Vivian proposed it, I saw an opportunity. Your return would rattle Vance, maybe force him to make mistakes. So I'm bait. And here I thought I was using you to clear my name. Lightning flashed, illuminating Elliot's face, the strain evident in ways she hadn't noticed before. Why keep it from me once we were married? Cassie asked, her anger softening. Plausible deniability, he replied. If Vance suspected I was onto him, he'd be more careful. But if he thought you were investigating alone, driven by personal vendetta, he might get sloppy. But we could have accomplished more working together. Would you have trusted anything I told you? Or would you have assumed I was manipulating you further? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Show me what you found, she said instead of answering. They spent the next hour reviewing Elliot's investigation. The pattern was clear. Vance had been systematically siphoning funds through a complex web of transactions, using Cassie's credentials to authorize key movements. He needed a fall guy, Cassie murmured. You were perfect, Elliot agreed. Ambitious, detail-oriented, with the necessary system access. And Meredith's involvement? She oversees the accounting systems where much of this happened. She had to be involved. The lights flickered back on suddenly, the room's details jumping into sharp relief. In the full light, they were abruptly aware of their proximity. Cassie stood quickly. All this time, I thought you were either complicit or oblivious. And I never thought you'd be methodical enough to trace it back to Vance on your own, Elliot admitted. I underestimated you. So what now? We've both been investigating separately. Do we continue that way or? We work together, Elliot said decisively. Pool our resources, coordinate our approach. Cassie hesitated. How do I know I can trust you? You don't. And I don't know if I can trust you either. His gaze was steady. But we both want the same thing, to expose Vance and save Monarch. That will have to be enough. The next morning, Vance and Meredith were conspicuously absent, having departed early for urgent business in the city. After breakfast, Cassie and Elliot walked the grounds to speak privately. They know we're on to them, Cassie said when they were alone. Last night's power outage gave them the perfect opportunity to search our rooms. Agreed. The motion detector that triggered, it was near our wing. They reached a stone bench overlooking the lake. We need a plan, Cassie said. If they know we're investigating, they might accelerate whatever they're doing. Or try to discredit us further. Vance has board connections I can't match. We need proof they can't ignore. The missing link between the offshore accounts and Monarch's funds. Elliot nodded. There's a board meeting Thursday, followed by the annual shareholders meeting Friday. If we're going to move, it needs to be before then. The quarterly compliance audit starts Monday, Cassie said. I could request specialized access to cross-reference transaction patterns. I'll authorize it personally. They spent the morning outlining their strategy, finding an unexpected rhythm in their collaboration. By lunch, they had a concrete plan. As they walked back to the house, Elliot surprised her by taking her hand, an unnecessary gesture with no one watching. When she glanced at him questioningly, he shrugged. Practice, he said, but didn't release her hand. That evening's cocktail reception brought local financial leaders to the estate. Throughout the event, they maintained their loving couple persona, but something had shifted. The touches that had once been calculated now lingered. The smiles came more naturally. You're very convincing, Blake commented when he found Cassie alone. One might almost believe you actually care for him. That is the point of our arrangement, Cassie replied coolly. Just remember, it is an arrangement. With an expiration date. His words bothered her more than they should have. She knew the terms of their deal, 1 year, then divorce. Later that night, as they prepared to return to Chicago, Cassie found Elliot in the library. Blake thinks I'm getting too comfortable in my role as your wife, she said. Blake worries I'm getting too comfortable with you as my wife, Elliot countered. He's not wrong. The admission hung in the air between them. This is temporary, Cassie reminded him, uncertain whether she was convincing him or herself. Once Vance is exposed, the company still needs the Al Nasser deal, Elliot responded. Our contract stands for 1 year, regardless. And then what? Then we reassess, he said simply. But first, we focus on Vance. Back in Chicago, they threw themselves into their investigation. By Tuesday afternoon, Cassie had isolated a pattern of transactions that created a damning picture. Vance had used complex derivatives to obscure the movement of nearly $30 million. The board meets tomorrow, Elliot said when she presented her findings. We need to organize this into something irrefutable. They worked late into the night. Around midnight, exhaustion momentarily overtook them. When this is over, Cassie asked, what happens to us? Elliot looked up from his computer. I don't know, he admitted. I hadn't planned beyond exposing Vance. You mean you hadn't planned on actually liking your fake wife? She said, attempting humor. He studied her for a long moment. No, he said finally. I hadn't. The admission shifted the atmosphere between them. Cassie was acutely aware of their solitude, the late hour, the tension that had been building for weeks. Elliot moved toward her, his hand lifting to touch her cheek, a gesture too intimate to be for show. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the moment. An emergency board meeting had been called for 8 a.m. Vance is making his move, Elliot said. He must have realized we're close to exposing him. As they prepared to leave for the office, Elliot pulled Cassie aside. Whatever happens today, I need you to know something. I didn't just marry you to save the company or to use you as bait for Vance. Why did you then? Because something told me you were the one person who might be as determined to find the truth as I was. His hand found hers. I was right. They arrived at Monarch Capital at dawn, determined to prepare before the emergency board meeting. The building was eerily quiet, only security and a handful of early workers present. I'll secure the evidence in my office safe, Elliot said as they rode the executive elevator. The board can't ignore hard proof. Cassie nodded, her mind racing through contingencies. I'll go to compliance and pull the final transaction records. We still need to verify the routing numbers on those last transfers. When the elevator doors opened, they found Blake waiting, his expression unreadable. "Early morning, Blake?" Elliot asked casually. "Just ensuring everything's ready for the board meeting, sir." His eyes flickered to Cassie. "Some sensitive matters will be discussed today." "I'm sure," Elliot replied. "Cassie, I'll see you in my office in 30 minutes." In the compliance department, Cassie quickly accessed the secure terminal, pulling the final pieces of evidence they needed. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Blake's appearance at that hour was suspicious. He'd never shown up before Elliot in the past. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the archived security logs from March 15th, Vance's keycard access." Puzzled but intrigued, Cassie pulled up the logs. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Vance had accessed the system using her credentials while she was demonstrably in a client meeting across town. The smoking gun they needed. She printed the records and hurried toward Elliot's office, only to find her access denied. Her keycard, which had worked moments ago, was suddenly invalid. "System upgrade," explained the security guard apologetically. "Happened about 10 minutes ago. Only executive suite access codes work right now." Cassie tried calling Elliot, but her call went straight to voicemail. Something was very wrong. Using a service stairwell, she made her way to the executive floor, finding Elliot's assistant looking concerned. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Reynolds said you'd been called away on a family emergency. Mr. Blackwood's been trying to reach you. Blake told you that. Where's Elliot now?" In the boardroom. The meeting started early. Cassie rushed to the boardroom, finding the doors locked from inside. Through the glass panels, she could see Elliot standing at the head of the table, surrounded by board members, looking blindsided as Vance presented something on the main screen. She knocked urgently. After a moment, Blake opened the door, blocking her entry. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is a closed meeting." "Let her in, Blake," Elliot ordered, his voice tight. Inside, Cassie immediately understood what was happening. On the screen was a fabricated trail of evidence implicating her and Elliot in financial manipulation. As I was explaining, Vance continued smoothly. "The investigation reveals Mrs. Blackwood never acted alone. She and Elliot have been working together to divert funds, then orchestrated her firing and subsequent redemption as cover." "That's absurd," Cassie said, moving to Elliot's side. "We have proof that you and Meredith—" "We've reviewed your proof," Meredith interrupted. "Fabricated data attempting to frame Vance for your crimes." Rather desperate, Cassie turned to the board members. "We have concrete evidence of offshore accounts linked directly to missing funds. Evidence that mysteriously disappeared from Mr. Blackwood's office safe this morning." Blake interjected. He turned to Elliot with practiced regret. "I've served you loyally for years, but I cannot be party to fraud." Understanding dawned. "You," Cassie said, staring at Blake. "You've been working with them all along." Blake's expression hardened. "I've been protecting Monarch from Elliot's increasingly erratic decisions. Vance recognized my potential when you never did." "The board has heard enough," said the chairman, looking troubled. "Elliot, we're suspending you pending investigation. Security will escort you and Mrs. Blackwood from the building." "You're making a catastrophic mistake," Elliot warned. "The Al Nasser deal will proceed under Vance's leadership," Meredith finished. "They've already been informed of the transition. Security arrived to escort them out, the humiliation of being removed from the building painfully familiar to Cassie. This time, however, she wasn't alone. In the car, Elliot was unnaturally calm. They got to the safe. "How?" "Blake," Cassie said. "He must have been watching us all along, reporting to Vance. And now they have our evidence, while presenting their own fabricated case against us." Elliot's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. "We've lost." "Not yet." Cassie pulled out the security logs she'd printed. "I received an anonymous text directing me to these. They prove Vance used my credentials when I couldn't possibly have been at my computer." Elliot studied the logs. "This helps, but it's not enough to counter their narrative." "What about your encrypted folder? The one I couldn't access on your laptop?" Elliot's expression changed. "How did you know about that?" "I'm thorough," she replied simply. After a moment, he nodded. "It's insurance. Evidence so damaging I kept it separate. Records of Vance's involvement in the scandal that destroyed my parents 20 years ago. He was responsible for that too. He was my father's protege who betrayed him, then positioned himself as Monarch's savior." Elliot's voice was hollow, history repeating itself. Cassie reached for his hand. No, it's not. This time, you're not facing it alone. Back at the penthouse, they accessed Elliot's hidden records, devastating evidence linking Vance to decades of financial manipulation. We need a secure way to present this to the shareholders directly, Cassie said. Tomorrow's meeting is our last chance. Vance will have security watching for us. Then we need someone on the inside. Cassie thought for a moment. Someone unexpected. Vivian, Elliot realized. She's still a major shareholder. Vance can't block her. They worked through the night, preparing a bulletproof presentation and secure backup plans. As dawn approached, exhaustion forced a brief rest. If this works, Cassie said quietly, what happens to us? Elliot studied her face. That depends. Is this still just about clearing your name? It was, she admitted. Now I'm not sure. Me neither. He reached for her hand. But I want to find out. Morning brought the news that Vance had called an emergency press conference before the shareholders' meeting, clearly planning to cement the narrative against them publicly. Time to end this, Elliot said, determination hardening his features, one way or another. Together, they headed into what would either be their vindication or their final defeat. The conference room at the Chicago Plaza Hotel buzzed with tension as shareholders filed in for the annual meeting. Vance stood at the podium, the picture of concerned leadership, while Meredith and Blake flanked him like loyal lieutenants. Their earlier press conference had painted Elliot and Cassie as desperate criminals, their marriage a calculated fraud. Outside, Cassie and Elliot sat in their car, watching the live stream of the meeting on a tablet. Vivian's in position, Elliot said, checking his phone. She'll signal when it's time. Cassie nodded, squeezing his hand. We only get one shot at this. They'd spent the night transferring the evidence to secure servers and preparing multiple delivery methods. The case against Vance was irrefutable if they could only present it. I need to tell you something, Elliot said suddenly. In case this doesn't work. It will work, Cassie insisted. Still, he turned to face her. When my parents died, I shut down emotionally. The company became everything. My purpose, my identity, my redemption. I never let anyone close enough to see past that. Until now, a small smile touched his lips. Until an analyst with a stubborn streak refused to stay fired. The tablet chimed with Vivian's message. Now, inside the hotel, they slipped through service corridors, using access cards Vivian had provided. 2 trusted security guards, ones Elliot had personally hired years ago, escorted them to a side entrance of the conference room. Vance was in full performance mode. Regrettable situation, but rest assured, Monarch Capital's future remains strong under experienced leadership. Is that what you told my father before you betrayed him too? Elliot's voice cut through the room as he strode down the center aisle, Cassie at his side. Chaos erupted. Blake signaled hotel security while Meredith attempted to cut the microphones. Neither succeeded. Shareholders of Monarch Capital, Elliot continued, his voice commanding attention. You've been told a story about fraud and deception. You're right to be concerned, but you're looking at the wrong perpetrators. Vance recovered quickly. Security, remove them immediately. As the largest individual shareholder, Vivian announced, rising from her seat. I move to allow Elliot Blackwood 10 minutes to address this gathering. The chairman hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. What you're about to see has been simultaneously delivered to the SEC, FBI Financial Crimes Division, and major financial news outlets, Cassie announced, connecting her device to the presentation system. The evidence unfolded methodically on screen. Transaction logs, offshore accounts, and most damning, historical records showing Vance's pattern of behavior stretching back to the scandal that had destroyed Elliot's parents. 20 years ago, Vance Holloway engineered the downfall of my father to seize control of key investment strategies, Elliot explained. When those strategies recently began to fail, he needed another scapegoat. Cassie stepped forward. I was convenient, an analyst who had accidentally uncovered irregularities in his reporting structure. My credentials were used to authorize transactions while I was demonstrably elsewhere. Blake attempted to interrupt, but Vivian silenced him with a withering glare. The final evidence was devastating. Blake's own emails to Vance, detailing their plan to frame Cassie, then later implicate Elliot when they realized he was investigating independently. How did you get those? Blake demanded, face ashen. You should choose stronger passwords than your childhood dog's name, Cassie replied coolly. As the presentation concluded, the room fell silent, then erupted in questions and demands for action. Vance, seeing the tide turning, attempted a final gambit. The Al Nasser deal is with me personally. Without it, Monarch faces immediate liquidity challenges that could collapse the company. Actually, came a voice from the back of the room. Our arrangement is with Monarch Capital, provided its leadership demonstrates integrity and sound judgment. Khalid Al Nasser walked forward, his expression stern. We value family loyalty, Mr. Holloway, but also honesty. It seems the Blackwoods embody our values more authentically. Security, the real company security, not Vance's people, moved in to detain Vance, Meredith, and Blake pending the arrival of federal authorities. As the meeting adjourned into emergency session, Cassie and Elliot found themselves momentarily alone in an anteroom. How did Khalid know to be here? Cassie asked. I didn't tell him, Elliot replied, equally puzzled. The door opened to reveal Vivian, looking immensely satisfied. I may have mentioned to Khalid that today's meeting would prove instructive about American business practices. You knew all along, Cassie realized. About Vance, about all of it. I suspected, Vivian corrected. But suspicion isn't proof, and Vance was careful. I needed someone with personal motivation to find what I couldn't. So you orchestrated our marriage knowing we'd eventually work together, Elliot said, understanding dawning. I orchestrated an opportunity, his aunt replied. What you made of it was entirely your own doing. She smiled enigmatically. Your one-year agreement ends next month. What happens next is up to you. After she left, Cassie turned to Elliot. She manipulated us both. Effectively, he agreed. But I can't bring myself to regret it. The following weeks brought seismic changes. Federal investigators descended on Monarch, the board was restructured, and Elliot was reinstated as CEO with a mandate for transparency. Cassie's name was fully cleared, her professional reputation restored. 1 year to the day after their hasty wedding, they stood in the same rooftop garden where they had exchanged empty vows. This time, only Vivian was present as witness. The contract ends today, Cassie said quietly. Our agreement is fulfilled. Is that what you want? Elliot asked. To end our arrangement? I want truth, she replied. No more strategic alliances or convenient partnerships. Elliot took her hands in his. Then here's my truth. I married you for all the wrong reasons, but somewhere between hating you and trusting you, I fell in love with you. That's convenient, Cassie said, fighting a smile. Because somewhere between plotting against you and working with you, I did the same. So what now, Cassandra Blackwood? Do we honor our original agreement or draft new terms? She stepped closer. I think we've had enough contracts and business arrangements, don't you? When they kissed, it wasn't for show or strategy or appearances. It was simply for them, a new beginning neither had expected, but both had somehow found through the wreckage of their old lives. Vivian watched from a discreet distance, smiling in satisfaction. Sometimes the most profitable investments weren't measured in dollars, but in the rarest commodity of all, happiness.